"We don't want you." The words hit me before I could decide whether to laugh or to cry. They were small and precise, said like an order across a living room full of pastel balloons and paper fans, under a ceiling sprinkled with streamers that my hands had helped hang. Vivaldi was playing softly from a borrowed speaker, the same piece that had been on the radio the day Kirk and Mandy danced at our engagement party. A jaunty, careless sound that suddenly felt obscene. I smoothed the fabric of a green dress I hadn't worn in years and felt the old stitches at the hem protest. I had chosen it because it picked up the mint of the napkins. I had ironed it because I always ironed when it mattered. I had paid for this party. I had driven 7 hours with boxes of favors in the trunk. I had a granddaughter inside who thinks my lap is the center of the universe. "Please don't do this. Not here. Not now," someone whispered, a voice edged with panic and embarrassment. It might have been Mandy. It could have been her mother, Clara, or a guest who had never learned how to say what she actually thought. I turned and looked at the woman who said it, and then at the crowd. The room resembled a photograph of a life I had tried to build. Pink cupcakes, a table of small gifts tied with satin, tissue paper confetti in a bowl. Evangeline, my granddaughter, toddled behind a tower of diapers and tried to climb onto a chair. When she glanced up at me, the wonder in her face was like a small, private sun. I had come to celebrate her, to be grandmother in public for once, to see how my boy's life had curved into this new light. Instead, I stood at the doorway and was told simply that I wasn't wanted. I could have left. That would have been the courteous, expected thing. I could have turned the key in my rental car, pretended hurt, and gone home to the neat apartment where the clock on the mantel kept time with the slow, steady breathing I used to count at night when grief sat beside me. But grief had taught me one thing. Silence is a refuge only until it becomes complicity. I had raised Kirk by myself after his father died. I had patched scraped knees and thrift store suits, paid for extra courses when his grades slipped, and let him live in my spare room during graduate school. I had not raised him to look away when children or elders needed someone to stand at the edge of their defense. So I did something else. I took from my purse the plain manila envelope I always carried on days I had business, the kind with a string and a button, and I set it on the small table by the coat rack. I made no speech. I did not shout accusations across the room. I did not call names. Instead, with a calm that felt like a mask and a patience that had been my companion for decades, I opened the flap and slid out a single photograph. "Before I go," I said, and my voice was neither loud nor pleading. It had the small final authority of someone who had learned how to wait until the facts were ready. "I want you to see something." A hush, then the whispering hush of a room where something has shifted, and people are trying to decide whether it is safe to look. The photograph was nothing artful. 2 hands against a hospital sheet, a tag looped on an emaciated wrist. I had taken it in secret a handful of months before, in a dull room that smelled of bleach and lemon disinfectant. It was not a photograph for celebration. It was a photograph for accountability. I set it on the table like a single white stone. If you like dramatic true stories, subscribe. It was not a call to arms, only modern economy. People leaned in regardless. You need to understand how I reached that doorway with a manila envelope in my hand. You need to understand the slow accrual of small humiliations and the grinding of a relationship worn thin by omissions. I was not a vengeful woman by temperament. I am a woman who learned to count my losses and to make sure that no other loss happened because I had been polite. Kirk was a bright boy with soft, untidy hair and a laugh that started at his belly. After his father died in that cheap hospital room when Kirk was 13, we were the 2 of us. We scraped by. I took 2 jobs, taught night classes, sewed curtains between shifts, and learned that the human heart will reorder itself into gratitude if you let it. When he left for college with the thin leather backpack that belonged to his father, I cried for 3 nights and then began to save for his future like it was a domestic form of prayer. There are moments motherhood etches into you, times when you choose what will be sacrificed. My sacrifice was less glamorous than the novels make it out to be. It was the quiet redirection of money and time. I missed a few new dresses. I ate less beef. I took buses when I could have driven. When Kirk told me he had met someone, when he said her name, Mandy, I was thrilled. For a woman who had spent so many years alone, the entrance of another adult into my son's life felt like the end of an old season. I welcomed her in with awkward, encouraging gifts, and with the cramped, cautious space my pride allowed. I paid for dinners, offered a spare room for the first months they moved in, and when she said she was a caregiver in Phoenix, fierce and proud of her work, I admired it. Caring for another's parent takes a particular kind of grit and tenderness. I wanted to trust that. Trust is a generous currency. You spend it early, hoping it draws people nearer. The first small cracks were ordinary. Missed calls, postponed Sundays, a sudden preference for different traditions. On the surface, they were nothing more than the irritations of blended lives. One Christmas, I baked the traditional fruitcake that had been in our family for 3 generations. I wrapped it in parchment and ribbon and drove it across 2 state lines. I called twice a day that week. On the phone, a television murmured in the background. In person, they accepted the cake like an obligation and served it after dinner like a formality. Kirk left the table early that night. Mandy laughed and said, "We did Chinese this year," and there was no invite for next year. Small cuts healed into a numbness. Time has a way of enlarging the holes in a relationship. There were exclusionary moments that seemed trivial then. An engagement announcement that landed in my mailbox the day after I found out. A birth announcement photo cropped so that my name did not appear on the list of contributors to Evangeline's trust. There were things that should have been said that were not. Thank yous that turned into silence, calls that dwindled to emojis. The money I had given for the shower, the hall rental, the catering deposit, the hand-lettered invitations, wasn't charity. I had offered it because I wanted my granddaughter to have a day full of light and laughter that I could recognize as mine. The sting of paying for something and then being told I didn't belong inside felt like an insult that had teeth. I could have chalked it up to changes in young people's manners, or to the weird ways relationships redraw themselves when new loves come in. I did not. The elderly teach you to pay attention to patterns, because most abuse, emotional, financial, physical, starts the way this did: a slippage, a minimization, a small, plausible excuse. You see how it accumulates. You watch, and when you have watched enough, the pattern becomes a map. Mandy's job as a caregiver in Phoenix placed her in proximity to many such maps. She worked at Sunset Manor, a private facility that cared for people of means, some who arrived intact, others who left less whole. In casual conversation, she mentioned stories that made me uneasy. A relative who forgot to bring money to pay a bill, a patient who seemed to be missing items. It was easy to tell yourself that workplaces have anomalies, that sometimes money disappears because of paperwork or an honest accounting error. But there were things that did not add up. Phone calls she returned late, texts that vanished, small offhand remarks about helping with things that suggested a comfort with both care and financial maneuvering. I do not need or want credit for how the rest unfolded. I only want the truth to sit here between us like a lit candle. It takes only one determined person to choose to do nothing. It takes longer and more courage to stand and ask questions of those who prefer the quiet. I hired a private investigator because I wanted information, not theater. Because I wanted to know whether my unease had a reasonable cause. Because when you have a granddaughter who might be growing up in the shadow of something ugly, you stop giving people the benefit of every doubt. Detective work, I learned, rewards patience. The man I hired, call him Martin, drove an old sedan, smoked cheap cigars, and had the quiet, professional boredom of someone who had seen people's lives fall apart in ways that made him too tired for melodrama. I gave him a retainer and a list of questions and a photograph of Mandy's staff ID. I asked him to verify employment dates, to follow up on patient names, to check whether any complaints had been filed. I asked him to do only things that would stand the sunlight of a courtroom: interviews, public records, requests, polite inquiries. No breaking and entering, no hidden cameras, no hacking, no illegal recording. Not because I mistrusted him. He had a careful way of setting down his cigarette and looking at you like he would rather not lie, but because I had spent the last 50 years learning the cost of being wrong. If I was going to make accusations, I wanted my hands clean. Martin is an expert at the slow art of unraveling. Each thread he pulled had a small sound, like the loosening of a seam. He called me with each small catch: a ledger entry that didn't match payroll, a bank transfer listed as miscellaneous, linked to Eddie Smith, a night shift caretaker. There were nursing notes with strange absences, and an inventory list with diapers and ointment missing. I read the words and felt my throat tighten. These were not spectacular discoveries. They were the kind of administrative oddities that most people will shrug off. But patterns are patient beasts. Taken together, they began to map to a person. One call came through from a woman named Helen. "I am scared," she said into the phone when Martin connected us. Her voice was low, edged by the creak of hospital beds and the constant shuffle of distant steps. Helen had worked at Sunset Manor for almost 2 decades. She knew the routines, the administration, the unspoken ledger of favors and omissions that built themselves behind the smiles of staff. She called herself a witness, and she called herself small. She told us things that the facility had tried to file away under normal staffing issues: patients whose medications were altered, whose personal checks disappeared after staff members helped them write them at the kitchen table, a ledger that seemed to bend to certain names, and a patient named Vivian Schmidt, who had arrived with jewelry and a tidy account, and who had left far less herself than expected. When Helen spoke of Vivian, her voice changed. She described a woman with soft gray hair who liked the garden by the east window and who could recite poetry when she was lucid. Vivian's nephew, an executor, the court form said, had been out of town for months. He had trusted the staff to manage things. Helen said Mandy had been helpful with the paperwork. She had rewritten a check when Vivian's hand trembled. She had signed where needed. To hear Helen say those things felt like someone dropping a single needle on a vinyl record, a tiny sound, and suddenly the entire room hummed differently. Detective Rubin became involved not because I demanded it, but because Martin insisted that the paper trail needed police validation. Rubin had been the kind of cop whose mouth relaxed into a smile when he thought someone was telling the plain truth. He is a man built from a generation raised to value facts and records. He asked for copies of everything Martin had gathered. He listened to Helen explain what she had seen, and to the slow pacing of my own explanation. He did not promise me an immediate arrest. He promised to treat things with care. I learned that the legal world asks for precision. A ledger entry is not an accusation. A whisper is not proof. I learned to turn feelings into documentation. The little things that once seemed like intangible slights, late texts, excluded dinners, were now cataloged with dates, with receipts, with sworn statements. I began to sleep with a pad beside my bed and to write down every conversation that mattered. My neighbors thought I had gone terrible with worry. My son called it obsessive. The truth is that I was learning to make sure that if my instincts were right, I could stand and show an unimpeachable record. There were nights when I felt ashamed that my instinct had been to gather evidence rather than to sit quietly and forgive. But I had learned that forgiveness is an act for the forgiver, and accountability is an act for the harmed. I did not want Mandy to be humiliated for the sake of spectacle. I wanted the facts tracked so someone could take responsibility if responsibility was due, and I wanted my granddaughter to be safe. The more Martin and Helen and Detective Rubin dug, the clearer the shape of the problem became. Not every discrepancy pointed to a crime, but several of them dovetailed into a pattern. Small withdrawals routed through online payment systems, notes in case files that suggested help with financial tasks, missing personal items that cropped up in staff locker searches. Each piece alone might be plausible, the kind of clerical error that would cause a minor audit. Together, they formed a portrait of intentionality. There were other things, too, moments that were less about paperwork and more about proximity. A staff calendar where a shift was changed at the last minute so that Mandy would be on duty the day a patient received visitors. A photograph Martin found on a pared-down social media account. Mandy at a party with a small tray of bracelets, captioned with an inside joke about finding treasure. Helen told me about a conversation in the laundry room where Mandy had joked about helping out the elderly with a little extra, and the way Helen lowered her voice when she did, as if the words had burned her. I tried not to write Mandy off as a monster. People are complicated. Mandy had been kind to Evangeline when she was a baby and had taught her silly rhymes. She had been loud and protective the first time Evangeline fell down at the park. She had moved with a kind of quick competence into the life that is demanded of women who juggle households and full-time jobs. I kept returning to that, even as the ledger entries piled up. Compassion is not the same as consent to be deceived. There were practical moments that begged me to make choices. There was a phone call with Kirk in which he asked, hurt and bewildered, why I was going after his wife. He paced outside a coffee shop and said the things sons say when they feel torn, between a mother who held the map of their life and a partner who had claimed a place in its margins. "She's my partner," he said. "Do you really think she would do this?" I told him what I knew in the bluntest, cleanest way I could, and he swung between denial and a slow, pinched, thoughtful anger. "You can't ruin her over a hunch, Mom," he said, and I told him, "This is not a hunch. This is a pattern. I want you to see it before I do anything else." He did not hang up. That, in itself, felt like a small mercy. I began to keep Evangeline close in those months. There is nothing like the small, uncompromising presence of a child to remind you of priorities. Reading to her became a ritual. Simple books with thick pages and animals who said things like, "Good night." I would hold those pages in my lap and think of how fragile their world is. I saw myself in the mirrors of her small gestures. She loved the way I sang the lines I made up, and when she put her sticky fingers on my sleeve, the maps of suspicion faded into a tenderness that grounded me. There were nights when the weight of the waiting felt like a physical thing. I would sit by the mantel and listen to the grandfather clock mark the hours, the same clock that had outlived my mother, and if you believe in such things, my patience, and it ticked with the steady, impartial sound of time. The clock became an ally. If justice is a patient animal, then time is its breath. 7 months. It sounds like a number you could measure on a calendar without emotion. But for me, 7 months meant a dozen small phone calls, 3 travel weekends to Phoenix, a string of meetings with lawyers to understand what evidence would meet the test of a prosecutor. It meant learning to translate hurt into paperwork. It meant worrying that I was becoming someone who would choose confrontation over reconciliation. When Martin found the first incontrovertible document, a courier receipt with a forged signature that traced back to a night when Vivian's account registered a transfer, my hands trembled. That was the kind of thing that would make a jury's jaw drop, if it came to a jury. It was the kind of thing that made me sit very still and say a quiet, private prayer for the courage to see it through properly. I did something else then that I haven't said out loud until this moment. I began to test my own motives. I asked myself, in the quiet hour after Evangeline was asleep and the house smelled of lemon oil and the faint fabric of my life settled around me, whether I was doing this for the right reasons. There are people who expose for fame, who delight in the public shaming of others. That was not me. I had no desire to watch a life collapse as a spectator sport. I wanted to stop harm. I wanted to ensure that if there was wrongdoing, It would meet a legal response, not a private vendetta. There is an old, unromantic thing that happens when you choose to make harm public. You open a door that lets wind into rooms you would rather keep tidy. Friends pick sides, family fractures. Your own name is dragged across the lawn in conversations you do not get to moderate. I felt all of that coming in a slow, inevitable tide. That is the price of insisting on clarity where obfuscation is easier. We put together a folder that would have made my schoolteacher grandmother proud. Sworn statements from Helen, photocopies of ledger pages with highlighted discrepancies, bank records, the courier receipt, photographs Martin had legally taken in areas open to public view, and a digital transcript of interviews that had been given under witness protocols. There was also, more fragile and human than the rest, a letter Vivian had written in a lucid moment to no one in particular about her love of the East Window Garden. The letter smelled faintly of talc and lemon, and I kept it folded in the folder like a talisman. Detective Rubin told me that he would need time to build the case. "We can't act on feeling," he said. "We need cause. We need proof." He was right. I had come to prefer him not because he was my ally. He had no reason to be. But because he was methodical. I wanted a legal process, not a social spectacle. There were moments when the moral calculus felt unbearable. I drove back to Phoenix in a rain that blurred highway lights and wondered whether I was right to drag private family life into the sterile lights of evidence rooms. I thought about Vivian, about an elderly woman who had once threaded beads for hours and had a laugh that sparkled, and whose days had been let out to the care of people who had, perhaps, seen her as a ledger to balance. I thought about Evangeline and how often children are the most vulnerable witnesses to the way adults behave when no one is watching. Behind all of this was a quiet, stubborn ache, the ache of being excluded from my son's life. I had always believed that love is not ownership, yet our society has little language for the slow, polite erosion of a parent's place when the new family draws its own perimeter. The indignity of being told, in front of people I had assembled and paid for, that I was not wanted, carried a particular sting. It felt less like a slamming door, and more like a long, deliberate closing, the kind that makes you reassess everything on your side of the threshold. One afternoon, after another long flight and a hurried breakfast in a motel off the interstate, I sat with Martin in a cafe, and we laid out the folder between us like evidence in a courtroom. He tapped the courier receipt and the bank record, and then, with a small, efficient smile, slid across a photograph taken on a phone he had legitimately bought at a pawn shop. A snapshot from the facility's public garden. A staff meeting. Mandy standing with a stack of envelopes in her arm. There was a timestamp. There was a pen mark on one of those envelopes. It was not dramatic. It was, however, precise. "You're going to have to decide how you want this to be seen," Martin said, and he meant more than courtroom optics. He meant who would be the first to know, how your name would appear in the story, whether you wanted to be the woman who quietly set things right or the one who made the first move in public. He did not ask whether I was right. He only asked whether I could live with the consequences of exposure. I said I would rather be the voice than the silence. I said that if anyone in power had been negligent, I wanted them to be alerted. I said I would prefer the police to bring charges, if charges were warranted, rather than settle it with polite apologies and reassigned staff. I wanted children protected. I wanted Vivian's affairs reviewed. I wanted a prosecutor who could test the facts. I wanted consequences if consequences were deserved. I called Detective Rubin and told him we had more than suspicions. He listened. He asked calm questions. He told me to be patient and to keep the folder safe. He did not offer certainty. He offered the next step, an interview with a detective assigned to elder abuse and financial exploitation. It would take time. It was in that liminal space, between having enough to worry a detective and not having a public reckoning, that the idea of simply walking away from the baby shower felt impossible. My granddaughter's face had been a daily reminder that some doors cannot be left with the key in the lock. I thought of the photograph I had placed on the table that afternoon, and felt the small, fierce clarity that sometimes comes in moments when anger is braided with purpose. So I planned. Not a spectacle, not a humiliation choreographed for gossip's sake. I planned a reveal that would be about facts. A folder would be opened, statements would be read, a manila envelope would sit on a table. Those were the elements of a careful exposure. I told myself, and told the people who mattered, that this was about accountability. There was one other truth. Even as I gathered my papers and my courage, part of me wanted my son to look at the facts and still choose her. Love does not always require reason. Loyalty and love can steer a man toward blindness. I accepted that. I understood that telling the truth was not a guarantee of the choice he would make afterward. But I could not, in good conscience, permit him to make that choice in ignorance. On the day I returned to the shower, clean dress, hair set, the manila envelope feeling heavier than it looked, I remembered the long-breathed patience that had accompanied this work. I had not come to villainize a person I had shared smiles with. I had come to protect the young and the old who could not easily defend themselves. The room hummed with small talk. A baby toy squeaked in the corner like a metronome that kept the beat of ordinary life. I placed the envelope deliberately on the table. When someone said, "We don't want you," I understood that this was a hinge moment, not for shame, but for a possible remediation. The faces in the room shifted as if reading a weather map. A few people looked away. A couple of mothers exchanged polite, anxious glances. A woman near the punch bowl instinctively covered her child's ears at the idea that words might become sharp. I thought of Vivienne, of her soft laugh, of a garden by an east window, and I thought of Evangeline's sticky fingers. I had waited 7 months and 1,000 small decisions to arrive at this particular doorway. The clock on the mantel clicked on. I put my hand on the envelope and felt the weight of a quiet city night in my bones, the pool of small actions that had built to this moment. If you think this is about revenge, you do not know the texture of accountability. Revenge is spectacle without remedy. Accountability is uncomfortable and necessary. I did not crave the clatter of someone being exposed. I craved the safety that comes when people who have power over others are required to answer for what they do. That is where I stood then, at the threshold of a party I had paid for, with a manila envelope at my palm and a choice to make. I had done my part to collect facts. I had spoken to a detective who promised to investigate. I had Helen's statement in my folder, and Martin's careful, efficient notes. I had done enough to make a path for justice. What I did not have was any guarantee that the exposure would lead to anything more than noise. When I closed the green dress around my shoulders, I felt suddenly very old and very young at once. The room smelled of sugar and baby lotion. The streamers shivered in the air conditioning. Vivaldi drifted like a ghost of the past. And behind the polite, lacquered surfaces of the afternoon, the quiet work of months had pooled into an ordinary-looking envelope. I breathed in, listening to the grandfather clock I had left running at home in my head, felt the steady, impartial tick of time, and stepped forward. My hand found the manila flap and lifted it just enough. The next sound in the room was the small, surprised intake of breath that people make when an object that has been benign becomes charged. For a moment, the party seemed to hold its breath with me. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, eyes turned toward me. I was about to unfold what 7 months of patience and slow inquiry had created. The next sound in the room was the small, surprised intake of breath that people make when an object that has been benign becomes charged. For a moment, the party seemed to hold its breath with me. Then Mandy broke it. He broke. She made a sound that was not a word at first, half gasp, half laugh, like somebody trying to decide whether the world was a mistake or a wicked joke. Her hand flew to her mouth. The color drained from her face as if the fluorescent light itself had leached it away. "What is that?" she said, and her voice was high and thin. I did not answer. I let the photograph and the paper beneath sit on the table like a small, cold altar. People leaned. Someone asked, "Is that—" and then stopped as if afraid to finish a sentence that might name what no one wanted in their kitchens. Clara, Mandy's mother, moved as if to intercept, to put a hand on her daughter's arm and smooth the moment back into polite surfaces. "Please," she said, and her voice had that particular tremor of people who think public life will hold what private life cannot. "Please, not here." I looked at Clara. I had known her for one awkward holiday meal and 2 polite brunches. She was not the villain of this story. She was, like most of us, an actor placed in a role she did not write. "This is precisely where it must be," I said softly. "Children are here. People who care about these children are here. The facts belong where people who care can see them." Mandy came closer, her jaw tight. She reached for the photograph and then snatched her hand back, like it had burned her. "You can't," she began, and the words stumbled. "You can't do this." Her eyes flicked to the envelope, to the newspaper clipping I'd included, to a neat business card that listed a courier company, and beneath it, the name of the person who had signed for a transfer. "Why would you bring this here?" she asked, as if she had been ambushed by the concept of accountability itself. A woman from the neighborhood, one of those small world acquaintances you only know because your children play in the same park, said, "You shouldn't," and stopped because she could see, suddenly, that being polite could look like complicit silence. The recorder I had included clicked. It was an innocuous one, the kind an investigator uses to capture a statement at a kitchen table. Martin had insisted I bring it. It recorded nothing theatrical, only a short clip in which a nurse at Sunset Manor described missing checks and an odd pattern of signatures. When I let it play, the room fell even further into silence. You could hear the tick of the hotel conference room clock in the recording, the small Mr. Potato Head laugh of a baby toy in the background of the party, both compressed into a thin, ordinary tape that suddenly had the heft of proof. Kirk arrived a minute later than I expected, because, of course, he did. He had been across the street at the bakery trying to smudge the edges of what was happening into something he could understand. He pushed through a pair of balloons and took in the photograph and the envelope and the faces like a man catching his balance on a leash. "What's—" he began, and then his gaze landed on Mandy. For a moment, he saw only her. Then he saw the photograph. His body changed in the space of a breath, defensive first, then braced, then slow, as if something inside him had been asked to shift its loyalties by evidence rather than emotion. "Mandy, talk to me," he said. His voice had the soft edge of someone trying to hold 2 truths at once. "What is all this?" Mandy looked at him, and then at me, and then at the running eyes of the guests. She moved like a person trying to decide what to do with her hands. This is my life," she said, a little crooked. "You can't just—" I stepped forward then because the room needed a clear fact, not more hedging. "I will say exactly what I know," I said. "I have a folder. I handed copies to Detective Rubin. I gave them to the private investigator. These are records that show withdrawals, courier receipts, and witness statements. Helen Gahn will testify about what she saw at Sunset Manor. I have copies of the bank records. They connect to transfers and to signatures that don't belong to the person who wrote them." Kirk's face paled. He held himself as if someone had demanded he sit on an edge and decide which way to fall. "This isn't true," he said at first, like a blessing he hoped would undo the scene. "Mandy wouldn't—" "Would you like to see my copy?" I asked him. I slid the trust fund document I had had printed, the paper that showed the contribution I had made for Evangeline, and the notation that had left my name off the public list, and placed it on the table. It was small theater, a check that had become a symbol. I was not trying to humiliate him. This was the only lever left that might get his attention. He picked it up as if by instinct, his fingers trembling. For a long minute he read and did not say anything. The room receded around him. Guests became pictures on the periphery. He looked at Mandy, at Clara, at his mother, at me, And the man I knew since he was small closed his mouth and then opened it in a way that told me he was trying to buy time to think. Mandy's face contorted. Tears leaked from her eyes and she wiped them with the back of her hand. "Please don't do this," she said again. "Not here. Not today." "Not today?" I repeated. "Today is when children should be safe." Her voice hardened. "You have no right to make a scene." I heard applause in my head, the polite kind that tries to smooth edges for everyone. I heard, too, the ticking of a clock that had been with me through sleepless nights. "I paid for this room," I said. "I have a right to be here. And you," I looked at Mandy, "you have been trusted to take care of elders. If those who are vulnerable may be harmed because of what you did, I will not let it be smoothed over in conversation." There was a moment then when the air shifted and you could feel the weight of choices. Some guests moved toward the door, unwilling to be in the middle of something that might stain their afternoon. Others stayed, their eyes wide. A woman I've never seen before touched her child's sleeve and whispered, "Oh my God," like a prayer or a benediction. Kirk, who had been balancing between denial and a slow dawning, finally took off his jacket and sat on the edge of a chair. He looked exhausted. "Mom," he said, and it was the kind of word that folded like paper. "I don't want to believe this about Mandy, but I can't not look either." He opened my folder and began to read aloud, haltingly, as if each line was a cold thing landing on his hand. The first papers were small. Bank statements with highlighted lines, a courier receipt with a signature that did not match the signature on other personal documents. Then there was Helen's written note. Kirk read slowly, and then the color left his face completely. In the corner of the room, Evangeline toddled over to a fallen napkin and picked it up with the single-minded focus of a child, oblivious. "Do you have to do this here?" Clara asked again, her voice rising like a sponge being squeezed. "This is a party. For our baby. For my daughter." "This is also a place where a child is present," I said. "If the adults who take care of our elders are making choices that would put children in a household with someone who misappropriates funds or neglects medication, I'm going to ask those adults to answer for it, where people who love these children can hear." Mandy's shoulders began to shake. "You think I'm some kind of criminal?" she said, and for a second there was a flash of something softer, at odds with the stone her face had become. "You think I'm a thief?" "I think there is evidence that needs answering," I said. "I think Helen's statement and the ledger entries and the courier receipt do not belong to the realm of small misunderstanding." The room held itself for another beat. Someone muttered about police. Someone else reached for a napkin. The radio in the corner kept playing Vivaldi, as if nothing inside the room had changed. Outside the plate glass windows, a life continued its small, indifferent rotation. Then, as if pulled by a string, Mandy moved. She gathered a few folded diapers from the gift table, shoved a small, unclaimed toy into her bag, and made for the doorway. She had the look of someone leaving a stage while people watched, because audiences are easier to manage than consequences. "I have to go," she said. "This has gone too far." She was not graceful. She was frightened. She tried the lobby doors, and they did not open fast enough. Someone said she couldn't go, that it was right to stay and speak. She pushed them aside and left anyway. She marched into the bright afternoon with the swiftness of someone fleeing the consequences of a life she had made complicated for others. Kirk stood up so suddenly his chair scraped. He ran to the door where she had gone. For a stretch of seconds he was gone, and then he came back inside, breathless, eyes wide like a child who had swallowed an apple seed. He had not stopped her, nor had he called the police. He simply walked back to the table and looked at me like a man whose last safe harbor had been receding down a river. Detective Rubin called within the hour. He asked for the folder and for a full recounting of what had happened. He told me calmly that an arrest would be facilitated if there was probable cause, and that he had assigned officers to look into Mandy's current whereabouts. It was not the dramatic, "we've got her" kind of voice you hear in television shows. It was a voice that had to be patient with the law's slow teeth. "If she attempts to flee," he said, "we will proceed appropriately. We will do it by the book." I had imagined, in the raw hours after the shower, that the truth would land on the world like a stone and the ripples would be predictable. Life does not behave like that. Mandy kept moving in circles of her own making. She stayed away from home for a few days. There were flight purchase attempts, a credit card swipe that Martin had flagged as odd. He called me with the good, clean clarity he always used. "She's buying a one-way ticket," he said. "She's trying to get out of state." I told him everything I knew, and he told me what the law allowed. He did not suggest anything illegal. He suggested patience. It was at the airport when the real turning point came. I don't know the precise operational steps that Detective Rubin's team took. I know only what I was told, that they had enough cause, that a warrant of questioning had been issued, and that an officer detained Mandy before she boarded a plane. I learned later that she had been carrying a small duffel, that she had kissed Evangeline's forehead and whispered something I did not hear, and that she had been taken into custody at a gate with neon advertisements flickering behind them like a bright, indifferent audience. When an officer finally called me to say she had been arrested, I felt a rush of many things: relief, exhaustion, a hollow ache. It was not the cinematic handcuff moment I had feared. It was a procedural fact that sat in a report. They asked me to come to Phoenix for a statement. I did. Helen flew in to testify. She sat in a small, corroded office near the police station and told her story with a voice that had been smoothed by fear. Her testimony was not dramatic. It was careful and human, and full of small details that made the ledger pages ugly and human. She spoke of Vivian's laugh. She spoke of missing jars of ointment, and of a day when a check had been written in a script that did not match the shaky cursive Vivian used when her hands were strong. She spoke of a conversation at the nurse's station where Mandy had laughed and said something that Helen had found offhand and wrong. Her words were not a sermon. They were a series of small, blunt facts, and they landed like a simple kind of accusation. People we place trust in do sometimes betray it. The prosecutor assigned to the case treated it with a gravity that mirrored my own. He mapped the ledger entries to bank transfers and the courier receipt to a transfer that had moved money the afternoon Vivian had not authorized it. He presented the photographs Martin had legally obtained. He described the chain that connected the funds back to accounts that were traceable. The defense, when it spoke, tried to make Mandy not a villain, but a person who had made desperate choices, someone with a backstory of tight margins and overwhelmed compassion. They wanted the jury to see a woman, not a portrait of criminality. There was a moment in court when Mandy looked small in the chair. She had shed her assertive stage and been left with a person who had to answer for the actions she had taken. She said she was sorry in a voice that trembled. She spoke about mistakes and about the pressure of living between shifts and caring for others when there is no proper pay. She did not make excuses for everything, but she asked, in the quiet of her own voice, for the court to see where she had come from. We do not live without contradiction. I had spent months collecting facts that had to be tested in a legal arena. I was not a monster for doing it. Mandy was not a monster either, not in the cartoonish way that horror movies make villains. She was a woman who had also been the object of love and tenderness, and who had, in the worst possible way, allowed certain behaviors to become normalized. Justice, I had to remind myself, is not vengeance disguised as righteousness. It is the sober application of consequence. Mandy ultimately pleaded guilty. It was a decision that shocked some and relieved others. A plea is a compact between law and person, an admission that carries with it a sequence of consequences governed by statute, precedent, and the temperament of a judge. The judge in our case was a man whose face had the lined patience of someone accustomed to reading lives on paper. He listened to the facts, asked the careful questions, and then, slowly, like a person measuring a recipe, pronounced sentence. She received 4 years, with eligibility for parole after 2.5. Those numbers are blunt, clinical on a page, but they carry with them a measure of what the law can do. Remove someone from a position of trust, demand time for reflection, and, in some cases, provide a path back if remorse and rehabilitation meet the state's standards. The prosecution asked for a sentence that would reflect the breach of trust and the harm done to an elder. The defense asked for mercy. The judge, feeling the weight of both, gave an outcome that balanced punishment with the potential for later reintegration. I sat through those sessions and felt, with a clarity that surprises me still, a strange mixture of sorrow and rightness. I mourned the person Mandy could have been, a woman with a bright laugh, a competent caregiver, a mother of small children. I also understood that those virtues did not erase the harm of misappropriation, of the diminished account of someone like Vivian, who had lived her last years with a dignity that should have been honored. The sentence was neither celebration nor revenge. It was a legal conclusion that left people fractured on the other side. There was another proceeding that followed, family court. The criminal case could not, on its own, settle the question of who would care for children or how visitation would be structured. My son filed for custody. That was a choice he made after long consideration, a man recognizing his duty to protect and provide a stable household while confronting complicated personal loyalties. Family court moves in a different tempo, one that considers the child's welfare above all. A judge spoke frankly about the need to prioritize safety and to consider what environment would best support Evangeline's development. The testimony there was intimate. Teachers' letters about stability, pediatric notes about diet and sleep, and the quiet observations of social workers who had sat in playgrounds and watched the interactions of parents and children. Kirk, who had been so torn at the party, stood in that courtroom like a man who had been forged by tough choices. He accepted the responsibility of custody. He did not do it out of spite or triumph. He did it because a child, indeed, children, need a steady presence. The judge ruled that custody would be awarded to him. Mandy would have supervised visitation if, and only if, certain conditions were met: treatment, participation, monitored contact, and eventual reassessment. The words supervised and conditional carried the legal weight of protection in a way that felt, to me, like both relief and sorrow. When the judge read the order, I felt a release so profound it almost startled me. I had wanted truth, not to manipulate a family into a shape I liked. I wanted to ensure that the vulnerable had people who would protect them. In that moment, the courtroom's air seemed to hold the thin possibility that children would be safer. Outside the courthouse, Kirk and I walked slowly to the car. He put his hand on my shoulder, not in the way of a child seeking comfort, but in the way of a man acknowledging that we had walked the same long road. "You didn't make me choose," he said, and there was a raw honesty in it. "You gave me facts." "I gave you facts so you could choose knowing," I said. He took a breath and said, "I hope she gets what she needs." It was not an absolution for Mandy. It was a prayer for healing in a life damaged by choices. I found myself agreeing. The human heart, even when it breaks, sometimes asks for the possibility of repair. The months that followed were steady and practical. Evangeline began therapy to help her name feelings and to give her a small, trusted person to meet every week who could help her sort the odd sensory memories children collect. She laughed as easily as a child should. She learned to find comfort in structured routines. She grew used to my reading the same book a dozen times and to the way I hummed under my breath when she fell asleep. Kirk moved his life closer to ours. He found a job that allowed more steady hours and started taking Evangeline to preschool programs in a small house not far from my own. There were awkward conversations, calls from friends of Mandy who wanted to know what had happened, letters from relatives who chose to take sides at a distance. We navigated it all with the slow diplomacy of people who had been through trauma and wanted the smallest result: safety. I filled the days with the ordinary acts of caregiving that had always been the truest translator of love for me. I made soup for them when they were sick. I sewed a tear in a stuffed rabbit. I learned the new rhythms of bedtime and the way Evangeline liked her cereal. The grandfather clock on my mantel ticked through it all, impartial and steady. The Vivaldi motif we had used at the shower became, in small domestic moments, a memory we could play to remind ourselves that ordinary music lives on. People asked me, sometimes harshly and sometimes gently, whether I regretted the exposure. "Do you think you should have handled it differently?" a neighbor asked on a porch one evening, and I told her the truth. There were regrets inherent in everything that breaks families. I regretted the pain it caused. I did not regret the protection it afforded. There is a difference between setting a family on fire to warm oneself and lighting a controlled flame to burn away rot. I had wanted the latter. There were quieter, more complicated feelings, too. When Mandy wrote from jail in the early months, a folded sheet in a thin envelope, her handwriting was cramped and small. She wrote apologies and told of classes she was taking. She asked, awkwardly, for updates about Evangeline. I kept the letters because they were part of the record of a life that had mattered to my son and to a child. They did not make me forgive instantly. They did not take away what had happened. But they humanized her in a way that a ledger cannot. I spent time thinking about the line between justice and retribution. People who watch these sorts of stories sometimes imagine that the one who exposes is some ironclad avenger bent on spectacle. That was not me. I wanted the law to do its work. I wanted consequences when the facts showed malfeasance. I wanted a court to say whether the actions counted as criminal, and if they did, to let the system respond in a way that could help prevent future harm. There were long nights when I checked my notes and imagined different endings. I thought of Mandy's childhood, of how people get flattened by the demands of life and sometimes make choices that harm others. I thought of Vivian in the garden by the east window, the woman Helen remembered, and of the way that small pleasures sustain a life. Both images fit inside me like awkward puzzle pieces. It is unsettling to hold them together, but the holding is necessary. In the end, the law took its role. Mandy served time. She was afforded programs and classes as the institution provided, and she was eligible to apply for parole after 2.5 years. That eligibility is not a promise. It is a legal threshold that requires meeting conditions that show rehabilitation and readiness. Kirk and I did not follow every bureaucratic step of her applications. We focused on the child in front of us and on the small tasks of making a life where a toddler could trust her caregivers. Custody matters required their own kind of rebuilding. Paperwork was filed, assessments were made, and at times the emotional tax of recounting scenes took a toll on us all. Social workers came and sat in living rooms and watched how Evangeline reacted when strangers entered. They observed me reading, observed Kirk making dinner, observed the way we comforted a small body after a fall. Those days tested patience. They also affirmed that the structures meant to protect children, tedious, awkward, necessary, sometimes work. There was a day some months after the sentence where I found myself sitting on the porch with Kirk as the sun slid like honey across the street. Evangeline was inside drawing a picture of what she called our house, a square with a lopsided sun. He asked me then in a quiet voice, like a man asking forgiveness, "Do you ever think you went too far?" I thought of the green dress and the manila envelope, and of the look on Mandy's face when she left the room. I thought of Vivian's letter and Helen's voice, and of the ledger pages that had not matched. I thought of nights when I would sit awake and run my hand over the mantel clock because the tick soothed me and reminded me that time puts things in order. "Do I regret the pain it caused?" I asked him. "Not in a way that undoes harm. Sometimes making the right choice is making someone suffer who has acted wrongly. That doesn't feel like joy. It feels necessary." I took his hand. We sat in silence, each counting our losses and our gains. The months and small years that followed were not neat. Evangeline would mention Mandy in a way that made my chest tighten and then bloom, all in the same breath. "My mommy is traveling," she would say sometimes, and I would kneel and explain in small, honest pieces without malice. We taught her to ask questions and to tell the truth about how she felt. Those lessons felt sacred. On the occasional bleak afternoon, I would take out the old folder and read a line from Helen's statement or a notation from Martin's hand, and remind myself why the envelope had been necessary. It could have been easier to pretend nothing happened. It would not, however, have been safer. I cannot say Mandy did not suffer. I cannot say the legal outcome made everything right. There is no ending that law can stitch perfectly to human pain. But there is a logic and accountability that allows new life to take root. There is a space cleared when harm is recognized and addressed, and into that space we tried, cautiously, to plant something steadier. People asked me sometimes if I had wanted Mandy to be destroyed. "No," I would say plainly. "I wanted her to be accountable. I wanted the law to answer the question so the family could rebuild with its eyes open." My conviction in that answer was steady because the alternative, silence, felt like a bargain with future harm. There were tender, surprising moments of grace. A mutual friend from early parenting classes brought over a casserole after Evangeline had her first cold and sat with me while we watched a cartoon. An elderly neighbor who had once knitted mittens for my grandson called and left a message of support. Little kindnesses reminded me that the world does not become monochrome because some parts of it darkened. Years pass, and the sharpness of some things dulls. Evangeline grew taller. Her hair acquired a new shade. She began to string words together in longer sentences and to tell jokes that made us laugh in a language only toddlers are permitted. If you ask me whether the family healed completely, I could not give you a tidy answer. Some relationships remain mended. Others are frayed. There is an uneasy peace in that knowledge. Mandy wrote from time to time as the parole clock ticked down. She asked about Evangeline and about small things. Did we still have the stuffed rabbit? Did the clock still tick? Her letters were hesitant. Sometimes she was contrite. Sometimes she was raw. I kept them in a small box in the attic. They were a ledger of remorse rather than proof. There is a line that will always haunt people like me who choose to expose wrong. You open a door that might mark you as the one who broke a family. That is a risk. But I believed then, as I believe now, that the refusal to let harm pass, unexamined, mattered more than the fear of being labeled the hand that unstitched a seam. If silence is complicity when children are at risk, then asking questions is fidelity to them. I have learned that truth is not vindictive by definition. It is a ledger that insists on being counted. It asks for a balance, and sometimes it requires repayment. I stood at a doorway with a manila envelope because someone had to. I paid for a party and was told I did not belong. That story is the opening image people remember. But the deeper story is why I could not accept that exclusion without looking into what lay beneath it. Sometimes people ask me if I forgive Mandy. I answer honestly. Forgiveness, for me, is a work in a long, imperfect progress. I have compassion for the child she once was. I acknowledge the ways life can harden a person into survival. Compassion does not erase consequences. It sits beside them. On gentle afternoons, I watch Evangeline chase sunlight across the floor and think of Vivienne and of Helen and of a ledger page that had refused to lie in the drawer. I think of the grandfather clock at home that keeps its steady tick, indifferent and reliable. I think of Vivaldi playing from an old speaker and of the way music can keep memory from sharpening into pain. If you came to this story wanting a neat villain or a tidy redemption arc, life will disappoint. There is no simplicity in human actions. There is only the messy work of consequence and mending. I exposed a secret because I believed, with the stubbornness that comes from a life of caretaking, that transparency protects those without a voice. You may remember the line that started this: "We don't want you." I remember standing in a green dress I had ironed and feeling excluded in a room I had paid for. I also remember placing a manila envelope on a table and realizing that patience, turned into action, can be a kind of moral muscle. It is not about vengeance. It is about the small, stubborn discipline of protecting children and holding those who exploit the vulnerable responsible. This is what I learned. Being excluded from a party does not justify making someone vanish. Exposing a secret does not require spectacle. There is a way to do hard things with hands that are not shaking with glee, with a voice that is steady, and a motive that sits quietly beside sorrow. I am not proud of the damage this caused, damage to relationships, reputations, and tender hearts. I am at peace with the fact that, in a world where many turn away, I did not. If this moved you, subscribe and watch the next story on the screen.